I didn't mean to hear it. I wasn't standing outside a door or trying to catch a conversation. I was walking down the hallway with my keys in my hand, already halfway out the door, when my dad's voice carried farther than he probably expected. He wasn't angry. He wasn't whispering either. It was the tone he used when he thought he was just explaining something obvious. "Your sister, he said she's not getting a penny." There was a short pause, the kind that means someone nodded or made a sound of agreement. I stopped moving without thinking about it. My name wasn't mentioned. It didn't need to be. The sentence had already decided everything. I leaned just enough to see into the kitchen. My dad was standing by the counter, coffee mug in his hand. My sister Jenna was sitting at the table, her phone face down in front of her, like she was trying to look serious. My mom was there too, on the other side, calm and quiet. I looked at her first. She didn't say anything. She just gave a small nod, almost automatic, like this was a detail they'd already gone over before I ever walked into the house. No one noticed me. That part hurt more than the words. I didn't step in. I didn't clear my throat or announce myself. I didn't wait to see if someone would soften it or explain. I turned around and walked out the same way I'd been heading before, keys still in my hand, door closing behind me without a sound. I sat in my car for a minute longer than I needed to. The engine wasn't on. The radio wasn't either. I just sat there staring at the steering wheel, letting the sentence replay in my head exactly as it was said. No yelling, no insult, just a decision. She's not getting a penny. I wasn't shocked, which surprised me. I didn't feel blindsided. What I felt was something closer to confirmation, like a question I'd never asked finally answered itself. I've been in the military long enough to recognize that feeling. It's the moment when you stop guessing and start adjusting. When you realize the plan you thought you were part of never included you. I drove back to base that night instead of staying. I told my mom I had an early start the next morning. She didn't argue. She just said drive safe the same way she always did. No one brought up what I'd heard. No one checked if I was okay. Jenna hugged me before I left, a quick, polite one, like we were coworkers instead of sisters. Back at the barracks, everything made sense again. The lights were too bright. The floors were clean in that way that tells you someone's been enforcing standards. I put my bag down, hung my uniform where it belonged, and did what I always do when my head gets loud. I made a list, not on paper, just in my head. What was said, who was there, who agreed, who stayed quiet. In my family, silence was never neutral, silence was consent. Growing up, I was always the one who had it handled. If something needed doing, it was assumed I'd take care of it. If something went wrong, it was assumed I'd adapt. When I enlisted, everyone told me how proud they were, but it came with a quiet relief. I was the one leaving. Jenna was the one staying. She was closer, more available, more present. I didn't resent that. At least I didn't think I did. I paid my own way through most things. I didn't borrow. I didn't ask. When I came home on leave, I slept in my old room, ate the same meals, listened to the same stories. I never asked about wills or money or what happens someday. That kind of talk always felt premature and, honestly, a little tacky. So when my dad said it out loud like that, it wasn't the money that landed first. It was the casual certainty. The way he said it, as if it were already settled, already fair, already understood. I thought about pushing the issue. I thought about asking him what he meant or why. But I've learned something the hard way. People don't explain decisions like that to be persuaded. They explain them to be acknowledged, and I wasn't going to give him that. Over the next few days, nothing changed. That was the strangest part. My phone still worked. My mom still texted me pictures of the dog. Jenna still sent me links to things she thought I'd find funny. Life kept going smooth on the surface, like a table where one leg has already been cut shorter, but no one wants to admit it wobbles. At work, I was preparing for a review that mattered. Not the kind that comes with speeches or applause, just the kind that opens doors quietly if you do everything right. I stayed late. I showed up early. I did my job the way I always had, the way the military teaches you to do it. No drama, no excuses, no expectation of praise. I didn't tell anyone what I'd heard. Not because I was protecting my family, but because I didn't see the point. It wasn't a crisis. It was information. And information, once you have it, changes how you move. I stopped thinking of my parents' house as a safety net. I stopped assuming there would be a place for me if I ever needed one. Not in a bitter way, in a practical way. Like crossing something off a list. A week later, my dad called to ask if I'd made it back okay. His voice was normal. Cheerful even. He talked about traffic and the weather and how busy things were at the office. He didn't mention money. He didn't mention that night. Neither did I. When the call ended, I realized something else that surprised me. I wasn't angry. Anger is loud. It demands action. What I felt instead was clarity. And clarity, once it settles in, doesn't rush you. It just starts rearranging your priorities without asking permission. I didn't know yet what that would mean. I didn't need to. All I knew was that something fundamental had shifted, not in my family, but in me. I started answering emails the way I answer orders, short, clean, and finished. That clarity from the night before didn't fade. It settled. I noticed it when my phone buzzed with a family group text, and I didn't feel the usual pull to respond right away. No irritation, no guilt. Just a pause, then a choice. At work, the day moved on rails. Briefing at 8. Equipment checks. A calendar reminder about a performance review I'd been prepping for weeks. Everything had a place. Everything made sense. It wasn't that my family didn't matter anymore. It was that the part I played with them finally had a name. I'd been cast early as the reliable one. The kid who didn't need reminders. The one who could handle it. When something broke, I fixed it. When someone forgot, I remembered. When plans changed, I adjusted. That role came with praise at first. Then it came with expectations. Then it became invisible. Jenna's role was different. She stayed close. She showed up for dinners and birthdays, and the small errands that get called helping out. She listened to my parents complain about work. She knew the neighbors' names. She had keys to the office. None of that made her a villain. It just made her present. And presence in my family carried weight. When I enlisted, everyone said the right things. They hugged me. They posted pictures. They told their friends they were proud, but beneath it there was relief. One less person to plan around. One less opinion in the room. One less variable. I didn't see it as abandonment then. I saw it as independence. That's how I was wired. I wanted to earn my place. I wanted standards. I wanted rules that didn't bend based on who was sitting at the table. On leave, I became a visitor. Welcome, but temporary. I slept in my old room with the door that never quite closed right. I ate whatever was on the stove. I listened more than I talked. When conversations drifted toward the business or finances, I stayed quiet. That was Jenna's lane. Or so it seemed. No one ever told me outright that I didn't belong in those conversations. They didn't have to. I learned to read the room. When my dad started explaining something and his eyes went to Jenna, not me, I stopped asking questions. When my mom said, "We've got it covered," I took that at face value. The phrase sounded harmless. It wasn't. At the office, my supervisor asked how things were going. I said good and meant it. The military doesn't care who your parents are or where you come from. It cares if you show up ready. It cares if you meet the standard. I'd built a life around that. I just hadn't realized how much I'd been compensating for the absence of it at home. That night, I replayed moments I'd brushed past before. The time my dad asked Jenna to sit in on a meeting with the accountant because it'll be good for you to know. The time my mom said, "You're never here anyway." Like it was a fact, not a choice they'd reinforced, the way decisions got made without me, then announced as settled. None of it was loud. None of it was cruel in the obvious sense. That's what made it effective. You don't fight what you're never invited to question. A few days later, my mom called while I was walking back from Chow. She asked if I'd be home for a long weekend coming up. Her tone was casual, hopeful. I said I wasn't sure. That was true. I had options. I just didn't feel the need to arrange my schedule around theirs anymore. She filled the silence by talking about the dog, about how busy things were, about how Jenna had been a big help lately. I listened. I always listened. When the call ended, I noticed my shoulders weren't tight. I hadn't braced for anything. I hadn't tried to earn approval that wasn't on offer. At work, the review came and went. It wasn't dramatic. It was thorough. Notes, metrics, next steps. The kind of conversation where you know exactly where you stand. I left with a clear sense of what was expected and what was possible. That feeling stayed with me longer than the meeting itself. I began to understand the pattern. In my family, being dependable meant being flexible. Being flexible meant being last to be considered. In my job, being dependable meant being trusted. Being trusted meant being included. I didn't confront anyone about it. I didn't see the point. Confrontation assumes the other person is open to revising the role they've assigned you. My family wasn't. They were comfortable. Comfort is hard to argue with. The business came up again in passing, the way it always did. A comment about a supplier, a complaint about paperwork. Jenna was deep in it now. I could hear it in the way my parents talked about her, less like a daughter, more like a partner. They said things like, "we," and "we decided." I wasn't part of that "we," and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to correct it. Instead, I adjusted. I stopped volunteering updates about my life, unless I was asked directly. I stopped rearranging leave to make appearances. I stopped filling in the gaps they didn't even see anymore. Not out of spite, out of alignment. The role I'd been keeping wasn't a favor. It was a function. And once I recognized it, I realized I could step out of it without asking permission. One evening, Jenna sent me a message about a family dinner. Nothing urgent, just an invite. I typed a response, deleted it, then sent a simple, "can't make it. Hope it goes well." No explanation, no apology. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was clean. By the end of the week, the clarity I'd felt in my car that first night had sharpened into something practical. I wasn't waiting for anyone to change. I wasn't preparing a speech. I was reorganizing my life around the information I now had. In my family, roles weren't assigned based on effort or fairness. They were assigned based on convenience. I had spent years being convenient. I didn't plan to do that anymore. And once that choice settled in, everything else began to line up behind it, without resistance. I laced my boots tighter than usual that morning, not because they were loose, but because I wanted the pressure, the kind that reminds you where you are and what's expected. The hallway outside my room smelled like disinfectant and coffee. Someone down the hall was arguing with a printer. Normal noise, useful noise. At first formation, nobody cared who I was related to or where I'd slept the night before. Names were called, numbers checked, instructions given. You miss something here, it shows. You get it right, it's noted. That's it. No backstory required. The military doesn't pretend to be warm. It's fair. There's a difference. I moved through the day the way I always do, focused, economical, not trying to impress. When you work long enough in a system like this, you stop craving validation. You learn to respect feedback because it's specific. If you're behind, you're told. If you're solid, it's documented. If you're ready for more, there's a process for that too. Mid-morning, my supervisor asked me to step into her office. She didn't close the door. She never does, unless it's disciplinary, which this wasn't. She pulled up my file on her screen and scrolled without comment for a few seconds, the way people do when they want you to wait without feeling judged. "You're consistent," she said. "That matters." I nodded. Consistent isn't flashy. It doesn't trend. But it keeps things running. She pointed to a line item and asked how I'd handled a recent situation with limited resources. I answered directly. No embellishment, no defensiveness. She asked a follow-up. I answered that too. We moved on. When the meeting ended, I didn't walk out lighter or heavier. I walked out oriented. I knew what I'd done right and what needed tightening. I knew where I stood. That clarity was new to me in a personal way. I'd had it professionally for years, but I'd never held it up against my family life before. Now that I did, the contrast was hard to ignore. In the military, responsibility comes with authority. You don't get one without the other. If you're accountable, you're looped in. If you're not looped in, you're not accountable. That line is clean. At home, I'd been accountable without authority for as long as I could remember. That afternoon, I helped a junior officer prep for a briefing. She was nervous, talking too fast, trying to get everything right at once. I told her to slow down and stick to the facts. No one needs the whole story, I said. They need the parts that matter. She took a breath and tried again. It went better. As I watched her walk away, I thought about how often I'd been told to just trust us back home. Trust without facts. Trust without access. Trust without any way to verify. That's not trust, that's compliance. Later, while I was logging reports, my phone buzzed. A message from my dad. A link to an article about a local event followed by "thought you'd like this." I stared at it longer than I needed to. Not because it meant anything, but because it didn't. It was small talk, surface level, the kind of message you send when you want to stay connected without addressing the things sitting between you. I didn't respond right away. Not to punish him, just because I didn't feel rushed. When I did reply, it was brief. Looks interesting, period. No questions, no follow-up. I noticed how easy that felt. The rest of the week unfolded without surprises. Training, meetings, paperwork. The quiet satisfaction of crossing items off a list that actually belonged to me. At night, I slept without replaying conversations in my head. I wasn't preparing arguments I'd never use. I wasn't rehearsing explanations no one had asked for. I started to understand something else too. In my family, closeness had always been measured by availability. Who showed up? Who stayed late? Who was around to be useful? Distance was treated like disinterest. In the military, closeness is measured by reliability. You don't have to be everywhere. You have to be where you're assigned when it counts. That distinction changed how I saw myself. I wasn't absent from my family because I didn't care. I was absent because I chose a life that demanded commitment elsewhere. They benefited from that choice when it made them proud. They dismissed it when it made me inconvenient. One evening after a long day, I sat on the edge of my bunk and went through my calendar. Upcoming deadlines, evaluations. A possible assignment that would mean more responsibility and less flexibility. I didn't hesitate. I confirmed my availability. For the first time, I wasn't factoring in whether I'd need to negotiate time off for family events or rearrange plans to keep the peace. I wasn't keeping space open for expectations that were never clearly stated anyway. I was planning like someone whose time mattered. A few days later, my mom called again. She asked about my schedule, about whether I was eating well, about how work was going. I answered honestly, but efficiently. When she mentioned how busy things had been at the office and how much Jenna had been helping, I said, "Sounds like you've got a good system." There was a pause. Not long, just enough to register. "Yeah," she said, "we do." I let that stand. After the call, I realized something had shifted in how I listened. I wasn't scanning for subtext or waiting for cues. I took the words at face value. They had a system. I had mine. At work, the possible assignment moved from tentative to real. It came with expectations paperwork and a timeline. No one sugarcoated it. No one promised anything they couldn't deliver. I signed what needed signing and turned in what needed turning in. The process was straightforward, transparent, boring even, and that was the point. When people talk about stability, they usually mean comfort. What I'd found was something better. Predictability, standards, a place where effort connected directly to outcome. I didn't feel the need to explain that to anyone back home. Explanation suggests you're asking for understanding. I wasn't. I was aligning myself with the only environment in my life that had ever measured me the same way every time, regardless of who else was in the room. And once I stopped trying to bridge the gap between those two worlds, the tension I'd been carrying for years finally started to drain out of my body one ordinary day at a time. I approved the assignment without asking for extra time. The confirmation email went out, and my calendar filled itself in like it always does when a decision is final. That same evening, my phone buzzed with a message from my mom that wasn't about me at all. It was a complaint about work dropped casually, as if I were still the person she used to vent to. "They're driving your dad crazy," she wrote. "Paperwork everywhere." I read it once then again, noticing how the words slid right past any mention of responsibility. It was always they. Vendors, regulators, accountants. Never the company, never the choices. The Carter business had been around my whole life. It was the reason dinner was sometimes late and weekends got interrupted. It paid for school supplies and vacations and the quiet pride my parents carried when people asked what they did. Growing up, it was presented as steady, reliable, the kind of thing you didn't question because it had always been there. I didn't work there. I didn't intern there. I didn't sit in on meetings. That was never my path, and no one pushed it. Jenna, on the other hand, knew the place like a second home. She had keys. She answered calls after hours. She talked about clients by first name. That didn't bother me. What caught my attention now was how often my parents mentioned stress without ever naming a cause. At work, I noticed patterns because that's what my job trains you to do. When something starts to fray, it doesn't do it all at once. There are tells, missed deadlines, defensive explanations, small errors that get blamed on circumstances instead of fixed. Over the next few weeks, the texts and calls from home picked up in frequency, but not in substance. My dad complained about suppliers. My mom talked about how hard it was to keep good people. Jenna mentioned staying late more often than usual. None of it sounded like a crisis. It sounded like a system stretched thin and pretending otherwise. I didn't offer advice. I didn't ask questions. Not because I was avoiding it, but because no one was asking me to weigh in. They were talking around the problem, not to me. One evening, after a long shift, I sat with my laptop open and caught a local news headline that made me pause. It wasn't about my family. It was about a company in the same industry being fined for reporting issues. The article was dry. Dates, amounts, quotes from officials who spoke in careful language. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. I closed the tab and went back to what I was doing. The thought stayed, though, hovering without forming a conclusion. The next call from home came on a Sunday afternoon. My dad sounded tired, not emotional, just worn down. "Everything's under control," he said before I asked anything. "It's just one of those stretches." I let him talk. He mentioned audits in the abstract, reviews, extra requests. He said it like these things were annoyances, not indicators. "Jenna's been a big help," he added. "She's been handling a lot." That line came up again and again. Handling a lot. It sounded impressive until you listened closely. Handling a lot of what decisions access pressure. Those words matter. At work, my days were measured in checklists and confirmations. If something wasn't documented, it didn't exist. If it existed, it had a name, a process, a path forward. At home, everything stayed vague. I realized that my distance from the business wasn't an accident. It wasn't just about my career choice. It was about insulation. The fewer people who knew how things actually worked, the easier it was to keep moving without scrutiny. I thought back to family gatherings where someone would ask how the company was doing, and my dad would smile and say, "Busy like that answered everything." No one pressed. No one ever does when the story has worked for years. Jenna sent me a photo one night of stacks of folders on her dining table. "Living the dream," she wrote. I stared at it longer than I should have. Not because of the mess, but because of where it was. Business on the kitchen table. Decisions bleeding into personal space. That's usually where boundaries start to break down. I typed a response and erased it. There was nothing useful I could say without being invited in, and I wasn't going to insert myself. A week later, my mom mentioned a meeting that didn't go great. She laughed it off, but her laugh was tight. She asked how work was going for me, then quickly redirected back to the company. I listened, asked neutral questions, offered nothing. That was new. I used to fill silences with reassurance. Now I let them sit. At base, we ran an exercise that exposed a small flaw in our planning. Nothing catastrophic. Just a gap. We flagged it, adjusted, and moved on. No one took it personally. No one blamed the weather or the equipment. The process worked because it was allowed to. Driving back to my room afterward, I thought about how different that felt from what I was hearing from home. There, every issue was external. Every pressure was unfair. Every fix was temporary. The business had always been described as something solid, something that could carry weight indefinitely. But even solid things crack when they're asked to support more than they were built for. I wasn't rooting for failure. I wasn't waiting for anything to fall apart. I was noticing how long it had been since anyone in my family spoke about the company with confidence, instead of deflection. When my dad called again, he asked if I'd heard about all these new requirements. I said I hadn't. He sighed and said it felt like someone was always watching now. That's how it is, I said, keeping my voice even. For everyone. He didn't respond right away. That silence told me more than any explanation could have. Watching isn't the problem when things are in order. It only feels intrusive when they're not. Over the next few days, nothing exploded. There were no announcements, no dramatic revelations, just the steady drumbeat of tension, the kind that builds when a system keeps pretending it's fine. I stayed where I was. I did my job. I kept my life clean and my focus narrow. From a distance, I could see the outlines of something shifting back home, not sharply enough to name, but enough to register. It wasn't my place to intervene. It wasn't my place to diagnose. The business had run on trust for a long time. Trust works until it doesn't. I went to sleep that night knowing one thing with certainty. Whatever was happening with the company wasn't sudden, and it wasn't personal. It was structural. The first official word didn't come through a dramatic announcement. It arrived the way most real problems do, through inconvenience. My dad mentioned a request that couldn't be pushed back. My mom complained about another form that needed signatures. Jenna stopped joking about long nights and started sounding tired. I noticed it because the language changed. Busy turned into reviewed. Paperwork turned into requested. No one used the word investigation, but everyone acted like time suddenly mattered. At work, when something gets flagged, the tone shifts in a similar way. You don't panic. You tighten. You stop improvising and start checking dates, versions, and names. You realize that whatever you thought was informal is now formal, whether you like it or not. That was the feeling coming through the phone when my dad called one afternoon and asked if I was free to talk. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. They're asking a lot of questions, he said once we got past the basics. Nothing serious, just thorough. Thorough is a word people use when they want to sound calm. It's not a calm word. He explained that some routine filings had triggered follow-ups. He said it like it was a nuisance, like a traffic delay you complain about and then forget. He mentioned timelines and deadlines, and how frustrating it was to pull records from years back. Jenna's helping organize everything, he added. She's got a good handle on it. I pictured the folders on her kitchen table. The way work had spilled into her personal space, without anyone noticing the spill itself. At base, I sat in on a briefing where an outside review was discussed. The officer running it didn't dramatize anything. He laid out the scope, the authority, and the expectations. He made it clear what cooperation looked like and what it didn't. Then he moved on. There was no shame in the room, just accountability. That difference stuck with me. Back home, the story was still framed as unfair pressure, as people who didn't understand how things really worked, as outsiders interfering with a family operation. What no one said was that the operation had grown beyond the family. The Carter business wasn't small anymore. It had contracts, employees, obligations. It interacted with systems that didn't care who founded it or how many dinners had been missed to keep it alive. Systems that only cared whether the rules were followed. I didn't insert myself into any of it. I wasn't asked to. And even if I had been, I wouldn't have known where to start without access. Access I'd learned was given selectively. The next call came from my mom early in the evening. She sounded rehearsed, like she'd gone over what she wanted to say before dialing. They just want to understand our processes, she said. It's not like anyone's accusing us of anything. I didn't argue. Accusations don't come first. Questions do. She talked about how stressful it was, how it felt invasive. She mentioned how long they'd been in business, how much they'd contributed to the community. I listened, recognizing the instinct to personalize something that wasn't personal at all. When she paused, waiting for reassurance, I said, if everything's in order, it'll work itself out. It wasn't comforting. It was accurate. After we hung up, I realized how rarely that kind of clarity was welcomed back home. Facts were fine, as long as they didn't disrupt the narrative. Once they did, they were treated like an attack. At work, the review process I was involved in moved forward exactly as scheduled. Deadlines were met. Documents were logged. Questions were answered without commentary. The system wasn't emotional. It wasn't impressed by history. It didn't care who you were on a personal level. That neutrality was a relief. Over the next couple of weeks, updates from my family came in fragments. A request for old files. A meeting that ran longer than expected. A consultant brought in just to be safe. Each piece by itself sounded manageable. Together, they formed a pattern that was hard to ignore. Jenna's messages changed too. Less humor, more logistics. She asked if I'd be around later in the month, then added, "Just checking," as if the question didn't carry weight. I answered honestly, "Not sure. I've got commitments." I didn't explain what those commitments were. I didn't need to. One night, scrolling through my phone before lights out, I saw another article this time about increased oversight in the industry. It mentioned compliance gaps and outdated practices. It talked about how common it was for family-run businesses to struggle when informal habits collided with formal requirements. I didn't forward it to anyone. It would have felt like commentary, and commentary invites debate. I wasn't interested in debating. The pressure back home kept building in small ways. My dad's voice lost its casual edge. My mom asked more questions about my schedule. Jenna stopped sending photos and started sending lists. At work, my own responsibilities expanded. The assignment I'd accepted moved from planning to execution. I was trusted with more because I'd proven I could handle less without complaint. That's how it works here. Trust accumulates. At home, trust had always been assumed. Assumed trust doesn't age well. My dad called again, this time late. He said they were bringing in additional help to manage the flow of information. He asked if I'd ever dealt with something like this. I paused before answering. Not to be dramatic, to be precise. I've dealt with reviews, I said. They're easier when everyone's clear on roles. He didn't ask what I meant, he just sighed. The thing about systems is that they don't speed up because you're nervous. They don't slow down because you're uncomfortable. Once they start asking questions, they keep asking until the answers line up. I could hear the strain now, not just in voices, but in omissions. There were things my family wasn't saying. Not to me, maybe not even to each other. I didn't feel satisfaction watching it unfold. I felt distance. The kind you feel when you're observing a process you're not part of and can't control, which in this case was exactly where I needed to be. By the end of the month, the language had shifted again. Review became ongoing, requests became requirements. No one laughed about it anymore. I stayed focused on my work. I kept my responses measured. I didn't volunteer insight or offer to smooth anything over. That wasn't avoidance, it was alignment. The system had started looking closely. Not because someone pointed it in that direction, but because enough signals had accumulated that ignoring them was no longer an option. And once a system like that turns its attention your way, the outcome stops being about intent and starts being about structure. My phone vibrated on the desk while I was reviewing a checklist, the kind with boxes you don't rush through because missing one means doing everything twice. I flipped it over without breaking rhythm. Unknown number. I let it buzz itself out and finished the line I was on before I stood up and stretched. When I checked the voicemail later, it was my mom. Her voice was careful, like she'd practiced sounding calm. "Call me when you can," she said. "Nothing urgent. We just want to talk." Nothing urgent is another phrase people use when something is very much urgent. I didn't call back right away. Not because I was avoiding it, but because I was in the middle of something that actually required my attention. When I did return the call that evening, I stepped outside where the signal was better and the noise was lower. My mom answered on the first ring. She didn't ask how I was. She asked how busy I was. "We're just trying to get ahead of a few things," she said. "It might help to get your perspective." Perspective was new. So was the plural. She talked around the issue for a minute. How complicated things had become. How many moving parts there were. How exhausting it all felt. Then she mentioned my job. Not by name, but by implication. She said words like structure and process and experience. "You understand how systems work," she said. "We could really use that." There it was. I leaned against the railing and watched someone jog past, earbuds in locked into their own world. I listened without interrupting. When she paused, waiting for reassurance, I said, "What exactly are you asking?" Another pause, longer this time. "We just need help making sense of everything she said. Talking to the right people. Knowing what to prioritize." She didn't say intervene. She didn't say fix. She didn't say protect. She didn't have to. I told her I'd think about it. That wasn't a promise. It was a boundary. The next call came from my dad 2 days later. His tone was different, more direct, less polished. He didn't dance around it. "This is getting heavier," he said. "We could use someone who knows how to deal with oversight, someone who understands how to keep things from getting worse." He didn't say my name, but it hung there anyway. I asked him what he wanted me to do. "Maybe make a few calls," he said. "Help explain how we operate. Make sure things don't get misunderstood." Misunderstood by whom? The question stayed in my mouth unspoken. I already knew the answer. After the call, I sat on my bunk and stared at the wall for a while. Not because I was conflicted, but because I was calculating. I've learned to do that before making any decision that feels personal. Strip it down. Identify the ask. Identify the risk. What they wanted wasn't illegal. It wasn't even uncommon. It was influence, soft pressure, context delivered by the right person. The kind of help that never leaves fingerprints, but changes outcomes all the same. I'd seen it before. Not in my family, but in other settings. It always comes wrapped in language about loyalty and understanding, about doing what's reasonable, about family. Jenna called next. She didn't bother with small talk. "I don't know how much you've heard," she said, "but things are intense. We're just trying to keep everything from spiraling." She talked faster than usual. She mentioned long nights and missed meals and how everyone was on edge. She said my name like she was testing whether it still worked the same way. "You've always been good at staying calm," she said. "We could really use that right now." I almost laughed at that. Almost. Calm is what people ask for when they don't want you to ask questions. I didn't agree to anything. I didn't refuse either. I asked what they needed most. Jenna listed tasks. None of them involved facts. All of them involved smoothing. After we hung up, I opened my calendar and looked at the weeks ahead. Training blocks, meetings, deadlines that had nothing to do with my family. Commitments I'd made to people who evaluated me on what I delivered, not how convenient I was. I could feel the old reflex kick in, the urge to step up to carry weight, because I could. That reflex had been rewarded my whole life. It had also been exploited. I went for a run and let my breathing settle the noise. By the time I slowed to a walk, the answer was already there. Clear. Uncomplicated. When my mom called again, I didn't let it ring. I answered and told her I needed to be direct. "I can't step in," I said. "I'm not going to make calls or try to manage this from the side." She started to respond and I cut in gently. "I won't interfere," I said. "I won't use my position or my name to influence anything." The line went quiet. Not disconnected, just quiet. "But we're family," she said finally. I took a breath, not because I was emotional, because I wanted to be precise. When things were stable, I said I wasn't part of the plan. I'm not stepping in now that it's hard. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize either. She said she understood in a way that suggested she didn't. My dad sent a message later that night. Short, controlled. He said he respected my decision. He added that he hoped I knew how much they appreciated me. Appreciation without inclusion has a hollow sound. I didn't respond. The next day at work, I was assigned a problem that needed immediate attention. A tight window, limited options. I handled it the way I always do, by laying out what was possible and choosing the least bad path. No one questioned my authority. No one asked me to soften anything. The decision held because it was documented and defensible. That contrast sharpened everything. Back home, my family stopped calling as often. Not because things improved, but because the option they'd hoped for was no longer on the table. Jenna sent one last message that said, "I get it," without explaining what she meant. I didn't ask. The space that opened up wasn't empty. It was functional. My days stayed full. My focus narrowed. The anxiety that had crept in with every unknown from home faded as my role became simpler. I hadn't punished anyone. I hadn't taken anything away. I just declined to be used as leverage in a system I hadn't been allowed to help build. When you say no cleanly without anger or theatrics, it forces everyone else to deal with what's actually in front of them. And from that point on, the conversations from home shifted again, not toward solutions, but toward reality. I stopped checking my phone as often. Not because I was trying to disconnect, but because nothing on it required immediate action anymore. The messages from home had slowed to neutral updates, appointments, meetings, words that described motion without direction. I read them once and put the phone back down. At work, the pace picked up. The assignment I'd stepped into demanded attention in blocks, not minutes. When you're inside something like that, there's no room for side conversations or emotional detours. You either track details or you miss them. That discipline had an unexpected side effect. It made everything else feel clearer. One afternoon, while reviewing a report with a colleague, I realized how little energy I'd spent lately thinking about my family's situation. Not because it had resolved, but because it had moved outside my control. And once something is outside your control, the only healthy response is to stop trying to manage it. Back home, the process kept moving. I knew that from the tone of the updates alone. The language shifted again, less complaining, more scheduling. My mom mentioned dates. My dad mentioned advisors by title instead of first name. Jenna stopped saying we're fine and started saying we're dealing with it. That's what people say when denial runs out. I didn't offer commentary. I didn't ask follow-up questions. Silence used correctly isn't withdrawal, it's restraint. At base, we ran through a compliance drill that mirrored exactly what my family was going through, minus the emotions. The scenario assumed mistakes had been made. The goal wasn't to defend intent, it was to establish facts, timeline, responsibility, correction. Watching it play out, I thought about how much energy people waste, trying to prove they didn't mean to do something. Systems don't measure meaning, they measure impact. Later that week, my dad called again. He didn't ask for help this time. He didn't ask for perspective either. He told me they'd received a formal notice outlining next steps. He read parts of it aloud, stumbling over language that wasn't written to be comforting. "It's all very structured," he said. "Yes," I replied. "That's the point." He didn't disagree. We talked for a few minutes about neutral things. Weather, travel, nothing important. When the call ended, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. Not because anything was over, but because the conversation had finally stopped circling. The system was doing what it was designed to do. Ask, verify, correct, enforce. No favoritism, no shortcuts, no consideration for how long you'd been around or how hard you'd worked to get there. Fair doesn't always feel kind, but it is predictable. At work, predictability is safety. I started to see the quiet irony in all of it. My parents had built a life around control of their business, their narrative, their family roles. When that control slipped, they reached for the one person who lived inside a system defined by rules they couldn't bend. They didn't ask me to teach them how to comply. They asked me to help them avoid it. That difference mattered. Jenna texted one evening asking if I was doing okay. No context, no request, just that. I stared at the message longer than necessary. Not because it was loaded, but because it wasn't. "I'm good," I wrote back. "Busy?" She responded with a thumbs up, and nothing else. That was new too. We'd always filled space between us with updates and explanations. Now there was just acknowledgement. At base, a younger service member asked me how I stayed calm when things stacked up. I told him the truth. "You stop trying to control outcomes," I said. "You focus on decisions." He nodded like that made sense, even if he didn't fully get it yet. That night, I reviewed a timeline related to my assignment and caught a discrepancy. Small, easy to miss. I flagged it, documented it, and sent it up the chain. No drama followed, just correction. That's how systems work when they're allowed to. From home, the updates became more factual, less emotion, more consequence. A meeting postponed. A request denied. A requirement expanded. Each piece landed where it should have months earlier. My mom mentioned how exhausting it was to keep up with everything. I told her I believed her. That was it. I didn't say I'm sorry. I didn't say hang in there. Those phrases imply someone else should make it easier. No one was going to make this easier. The business my parents built had grown beyond the family stories attached to it. It had become something that interacted with laws, oversight, and expectations that didn't bend because of legacy. That transition is hard for a lot of people, especially when they've spent years being trusted by default. Trust by default expires the moment you scale. I thought about the night I'd overheard that sentence in the kitchen, the certainty in my dad's voice, the quiet agreement from my mom, how casually my exclusion had been discussed. It would have been easy to frame what was happening now as justice, or irony, or revenge. It wasn't any of those. It was alignment. I hadn't triggered anything. I hadn't reported anyone. I hadn't pulled strings in either direction. I'd simply stepped aside and let the same standards I lived under apply to everyone else. That choice had a strange effect. It made me lighter. Not vindicated, just unburdened. Near the end of the week, my dad called again. Short call. He said things were moving slower than he'd expected. He said he wished they'd done some things differently earlier. I didn't realize how exposed we were, he said. I didn't say I did. I didn't say anything at all. Sometimes the most respectful response is to let someone finish their thought without correcting it. When the call ended, I went back to my work and finished what I was doing. The day closed out cleanly. Tasks done. Notes filed. Nothing unresolved on my end. Whatever was happening back home would continue whether I checked in or not. The system doesn't pause for personal reflection. And for the first time, that didn't feel cold to me. It felt fair. I felt it before anyone said it out loud. The tone of the calls shifted again, not toward panic, but toward gravity. People sound different when they realize the floor isn't moving anymore, and that they're the ones who have to. My dad called mid-morning on a weekday, which he never does unless something is wrong. He didn't ask if it was a good time. He just started talking slower than usual, like every word had weight now. They finalized some findings, he said. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask which ones. When a process reaches that stage, details are already locked in. He explained that certain practices hadn't held up under review. Nothing sensational. No fraud headlines. Just gaps, oversights, patterns that should have been corrected years earlier and weren't. The kind of things that don't matter until they do. There are penalties, he said, and conditions. Conditions is a word that changes futures. He talked about timelines for corrective action, about external monitors, about restrictions that would make running the business harder and more expensive. He said it like he was reciting instructions he'd been given, not decisions he agreed with. I listened without taking notes. This wasn't my problem to solve. My mom called later that day. She sounded tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. She talked about how everything felt uncertain. Now, how the business didn't feel like theirs anymore. They're in everything, she said, every decision. That's what happens when informal control collides with formal oversight. Ownership doesn't disappear, but autonomy does. Jenna didn't call. She sent a message instead. It was short. Can we talk tonight? I agreed. When she called, her voice was steady but tight. She didn't dramatize. She laid things out. Reduced hours, delayed projects, a plan to bring in outside management temporarily. None of it sounded optional. I didn't think it would get this far, she said. Most people don't. Systems don't announce themselves until they're already moving. She asked how I was holding up. I told her the truth. I'm okay. That seemed to surprise her. I keep thinking about what Dad said, she added. She didn't need to repeat it. I didn't know you heard that. I did, I said. Another pause. This one was heavier. I didn't agree with it, she said quickly. Too quickly. I didn't respond. Disagreement that isn't spoken when it matters is just a private opinion. She went on to say how complicated things had become, how everything felt like it was happening at once. She said they were trying to figure out next steps and how to protect what they could. We could still use your input, she said. Even if you don't get involved directly. Input is another soft word. It sounds harmless. It rarely is. I told her I wasn't going to weigh in. Not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't positioned to help without becoming part of something I'd deliberately stayed out of. You made your choice, she said, not accusing, just stating. Yes, I replied, and so did everyone else. The conversation ended without resolution. That was fine. At work, my own situation tightened in a different way. The assignment I was on entered a phase where mistakes weren't recoverable. Every decision had downstream effects. I checked assumptions twice. I documented everything. The pressure was real, but it was clean. Clean pressure is manageable. The contrast between that and what was happening at home was stark. Their consequences felt personal. Here, they felt procedural. The following week, the news hit locally, not a headline, but a notice buried in a business section. A brief mention of compliance actions affecting several companies, including my parents. No names highlighted, no commentary, Just facts. I didn't forward it. I didn't mention it. I knew they'd seen it. My dad called that evening. His voice was flatter now, less defensive, less explanatory. We're going to have to restructure, he said. Restructure is a polite way of saying things won't look the same again. He talked about selling off part of the operation, about bringing in partners, about the possibility that the company wouldn't stay in the family the way they'd imagined. He said it like he was thinking out loud, not asking for permission. I said, "That sounds difficult." It was the most honest thing I could offer. After the call, I sat in my room and stared at the wall for a few minutes, the way you do when information lands but doesn't demand action. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel guilt either. I felt recognition. This was the cost of decisions made quietly over time. Not malicious ones. Comfortable ones. The kind that don't get questioned until questioning is mandatory. A few days later, my mom asked if I'd be coming home anytime soon. Not for a visit. She didn't frame it like that. "It might help to have you here," she said. I asked how. She hesitated, then said, "Just to be present." Presence had always been my assigned value. Be there, absorb stress, smooth edges, make things feel manageable. I told her I wouldn't be able to come. She didn't argue. She just said she understood in a voice that suggested she finally did. At base, I watched a younger unit go through a corrective process after a mistake. No yelling, no blame. Clear steps. Accountability assigned. Support given where appropriate. Consequences applied evenly. It wasn't kind. It wasn't cruel. It was functional. That word kept coming back to me. Functional systems don't care how you feel about them. They care whether you adapt. My family was adapting now whether they liked it or not. Jenna sent another message later that week. "We're doing what we can," she wrote. I replied, "That's all anyone can do." It wasn't encouragement. It was acknowledgement. As days passed, the urgency in their voices dulled into something steadier. Still heavy, but less frantic. The reality had set in. Whatever happened next would be shaped by external requirements, not internal preferences. I stayed focused on my responsibilities. I didn't expand my role or shrink it. I held the line I'd drawn without announcing it. The strange thing was how normal everything felt once the dust settled. Hard, yes. Different, absolutely. But coherent. The family narrative had always been that we handled things ourselves, that independence was our strength. Now confronted with a system that didn't bend, that story had reached its limit. I wasn't outside the process looking in anymore. I was simply somewhere else entirely, standing inside a structure that did exactly what it said it would, every time. I didn't mark the date when things crossed from difficult to irreversible. There wasn't a single phone call or document that did it. It was more like a weight shift you feel through your feet before your brain catches up. My dad stopped talking about getting through this and started talking about what comes next. That phrasing matters. It's the difference between endurance and acceptance. He called one evening while I was cleaning my gear, methodical motions that didn't require much thought. He told me they'd signed an agreement that formalized the oversight. External management, regular reporting, restrictions that would last longer than anyone had hoped. "It's not temporary," he said. I told him I understood. He didn't ask if I had advice. He didn't ask if I could help. That more than anything told me how far things had moved. When people stop asking, it's because the door they were hoping to open has closed on its own. My mom's calls changed too. She talked about practicalities now, downsizing, selling off assets they'd always assumed would stay. Adjusting expectations. There was grief in her voice, but it wasn't dramatic. It was quieter than that. "This isn't how we pictured it," she said. "Most endings aren't." Jenna called less frequently, but when she did, she sounded older. Not wiser, just heavier. She talked about learning to take direction from people she didn't hire. About how strange it felt to answer questions instead of making decisions. "I didn't realize how much we were just winging it," she admitted. That sentence landed cleanly. No defense, no spin. At work, my own responsibilities reached a point where delegation mattered. I had people reporting to me who needed clarity, not comfort. I gave them timelines and expectations, and followed up without hovering. The system responded the way it always does when you respect it. It was impossible not to see the parallel. One afternoon between briefings, I sat in my car and checked my messages. A group text from my family lit up the screen. It wasn't panicked. It wasn't emotional. It was logistical. Dates, meetings, next steps. I read it, then muted the thread. Not because I didn't care. Because I didn't need to be in the loop anymore. That realization didn't come with relief or guilt. It came with neutrality, the kind you feel when you finally stop holding something that was never meant to be yours. Later that week, my dad asked if I'd consider coming home for a short visit. He framed it carefully, like he didn't want to pressure me. "It might be good to talk in person," he said. I asked what he wanted to talk about. He hesitated. Everything he said. That was the problem. Everything is what people ask for when they don't know what they actually want. I told him I couldn't make it work with my schedule. That was true. It was also final. He didn't push. After we hung up, I thought about the house I grew up in. The kitchen where I'd overheard that sentence. The hallway I'd walked down without being noticed. It didn't hurt to think about anymore. It felt distant, like remembering a base you transferred from years ago. At work, I watched a unit go through a transition that reminded me of my family's situation in an unexpected way. Leadership changed. Authority redistributed. Processes tightened. The people who adapted stayed. The ones who didn't moved on. No one took it personally. That's the advantage of clear structure. My family had never had that clarity. Roles were implied. Authority assumed. Boundaries flexible until they weren't. I'd lived inside that ambiguity for years without naming it. Now that I had, I couldn't unknow it. My mom sent me a message one night, thanking me for being understanding. I read it twice. Understanding what exactly? That things hadn't gone their way, that I wasn't stepping in. I replied with a simple, "I hope things stabilize." Stability is a neutral wish. It doesn't promise rescue. Jenna sent a longer message later. She apologized not directly, but around the edges. She said she wished things had been different. She said she hoped we could move forward without resentment. I believed her, and I also knew resentment wasn't the issue. The issue was alignment. I wasn't angry at my family for choosing each other. I was clear-eyed about what that choice had meant for me. Once you see where you stand, you stop trying to negotiate your position. At base, a junior officer asked me how I knew when to step back from something that mattered. I didn't give a motivational answer. You step back when staying would mean becoming responsible for something you don't control, I said. He nodded slowly, like he was filing it away for later. That night, I slept without interruption. No dreams about conversations I wished had gone differently. No replaying moments to see if I'd missed something. The business back home continued to change shape. My parents adjusted. Jenna adapted. The system held. None of it required my presence. That fact didn't make me smaller. It made me honest. Near the end of the month, my dad sent me a message that wasn't about logistics. He said he was proud of me. Not for my job, not for my discipline. Just proud. It was the first time he'd said that without attaching it to something he could point to. I read it and set the phone down without responding immediately. Not because I didn't appreciate it, but because I didn't need to capture the moment. It could exist without commentary. I'd spent years trying to be seen by people who only noticed me when it was convenient. Now, seen or not, I was steady. Whatever remained between my family and me would have to exist within the reality we'd all helped create. No rewriting, no retroactive fairness. I wasn't waiting for anything to conclude. I was already living inside the outcome of my own choice. I woke up before the alarm, the way I usually do now, with the room still quiet and the light just starting to push through the blinds. There was no rush in my body, no checklist forming itself in my head, just the awareness that the day was mine to step into one decision at a time. On the calendar, nothing had my family's name on it anymore. That didn't mean they were gone. It meant the relationship had found its shape. At base, the morning moved the way it always does, routine efficient, unremarkable in the best way. I ran through equipment checks, signed off on reports, exchanged nods with people who trusted me to do what I said I would. Trust here wasn't emotional, it was operational. You earned it, and once earned it held. I realized how rare that had been in my personal life. My parents still called, but less often. When they did, the conversations stayed grounded. No request hidden inside concern. No vague hints about what I might be able to help with. They talked about adjustments, about learning curves, about how different things felt now that decisions had to be justified on paper. My dad admitted something one evening that caught me off guard. We thought we were protecting the business by keeping it close, he said. Turns out, we were just avoiding accountability. He didn't frame it as regret, just recognition. I didn't respond with validation or critique. I said, that's a hard lesson. It was enough. Jenna's role changed too. Without the illusion of control, she had to define herself differently inside the company. She talked about training sessions and new reporting lines. She sounded steadier, less defensive. The exhaustion in her voice shifted from panic to effort. I'm learning more in 6 months than I did in the last 5 years, she said once. Learning isn't comfortable, but it's honest. There was no big reconciliation scene. No tearful conversation where everything got named and resolved. That's not how realignment works. It happens in small, consistent exchanges where expectations stay where they're put. When my parents mentioned inheritance again, it wasn't as a weapon or a reassurance. It was logistical. Plans had changed. Structures had changed. The conversation was factual, stripped of symbolism. I listened without reacting. By then, I already knew the truth that had taken me years to accept. What I'd built for myself wasn't dependent on what I stood to receive. My sense of worth wasn't tied to inclusion in a plan I'd never been allowed to help shape. I didn't need a penny to confirm that. At work, I was offered a new responsibility. Nothing flashy, just meaningful. It came with trust oversight and clear expectations. I accepted without hesitation. Not because it was a step up, but because it was aligned. Alignment turned out to be the quiet reward I'd been chasing without knowing its name. One afternoon, sitting outside after a long day, I watched a group of younger service members joke around half in uniform, half already in their off-duty lives. They looked unburdened in a way that comes from knowing where you belong, even if you don't have all the answers yet. I thought about my own path. How often I'd been told I was strong or independent, as if those traits meant I didn't need support or inclusion. How easily reliability turns into invisibility when people assume you'll always adapt. Walking away from that assumption didn't make me colder. It made me clearer. My mom sent me a photo one evening of the dog asleep in the sun. No caption, no subtext, just a moment. I smiled and sent back a thumbs up, then put the phone away. That was enough connection for the day. The family business continued under its new structure. It didn't collapse. It didn't rebound dramatically either. It stabilized slower and leaner, shaped by rules that didn't bend for sentiment. My parents adjusted. Jenna adjusted. The story they told about themselves changed. I didn't step back into it. And strangely, that made space for something healthier to exist alongside it. When I took leave later that year, I didn't announce it. I didn't plan a visit around obligations. I went where I wanted when I wanted. I spent time alone. I spent time with people who knew me outside of family roles. I felt no urge to prove anything. The sentence I'd overheard that night in the kitchen still existed in my memory, but it had lost its power, not because it was forgiven or forgotten, but because it no longer defined the perimeter of my life. I hadn't taken revenge. I hadn't demanded fairness retroactively. I hadn't waited for validation to arrive late. I had made one clean choice and let everything else organize itself around that. In the end, what I kept wasn't money or leverage or the satisfaction of being right. I kept my boundaries. I kept my clarity. And I kept the quiet certainty that comes from knowing exactly where you stand, because you chose it, not because someone else decided it for you. If you connect with stories like this, family revenge stories grounded in real choices, real consequences, and the discipline shaped by military life, consider subscribing to the channel. These are stories about boundaries, accountability, and what happens when the system finally speaks. New long-form stories are added regularly, and your support helps keep them coming.